What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Joey Maylari. So, earlier today, I recorded an episode about some recent trades in the MLB, and now this is my second episode of the day. I'm going to talk about Anthony Rendon's potential retirement, which is going to bring me into the conversation of the worst contracts in MLB history, and Rendon is definitely up there, and that's the reason I made this episode its own thing, is because I felt like I had so much to talk about with some of the worst contracts in baseball, considering a lot of these deals are going to be 7, 8, 10-year deals. They're always big multi-year deals with a lot of money on the line, and all of that being guaranteed in the game of baseball. So I made this episode its own thing because there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of bad contracts in MLB history. I'm sure there are some I'm missing on. I'm sure there are some that weren't necessarily bad deals at the time, but grew to be bad deals. And the same thing goes for players that were very good players, but were plagued by injuries over the time of their contracts. So let's start out with Anthony Rendon's potential retirement. There are reports out there that he's potentially considering retiring before the 2026 MLB season, is in discussions right now with the Los Angeles Angels on a potential buyout of the final year of his contract. He did sign a big-time deal in the 2019 offseason, signing a 7-year, $245 million deal with the Angels, which at the time was a big-time move for a franchise that was looking to build around Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani. They cashed in on probably the biggest, if not the biggest, one of the biggest free agents at the time in the 2019 offseason. He was coming off a really good year in Washington in 2019. This move made a lot of sense for a team that was looking to add power and talent in their lineup next to Trout and Ohtani, but obviously this move ended up being a major failure for the Angels. Rendon signed this 7-year, $245 million deal on December 11th of 2019 with an average annual value of $35 million. He did just miss the entire 2025 season due to hip surgery, and now if he were to miss the 2026 season, he would not have played one game over the last 2 years of this contract. He has 1 year remaining at $38 million for the 2026 season. Rendon and the Angels front office, including GM Perry Manassian, are discussing a potential buyout ahead of the upcoming season, which I already noted. Rendon, in 6 years for the Angels from 2020 through 2025, he played just 257 games over those 6 seasons. Over the lifespan of his contract, he played just 257 games out of a possible 1,032 games. And so those 1,032 games are 6 full MLB seasons at 162 games a year, and then also the shortened 2020 season due to the pandemic, which was 60 games. So in the event he doesn't play this year for the 2026 season, that would mean there were 1,032 possible games he could have played over those 7 years, and he only played in 257 of them, which is 24.9% of potential games he appeared in for the Angels. That's a hair less than 25%, so he didn't even play a quarter of the games in that contract. His total Angels stats, and this is if he were to retire before this 2026 season begins, he had a .242 batting average over his career with the Angels. During his time with the Angels, he had a .369 slugging percentage, a .717 OPS, hit just 22 home runs with 125 runs batted in, 112 runs scored, 10 stolen bases, 50 doubles, a 100 OPS plus, and 3.9 wins above replacement. In his final year in Washington, it's important to really compare that year to what his total stats were with the Angels, because that year in 2019 was a career year for Rendon. It was a major factor in the Washington Nationals winning their first World Series title ever as a franchise, and that led to him getting a major contract from the Angels that following offseason, getting that deal, as I said, in December of 2019. The Angels wanted to pair more talent with Shohei and Trout, and unfortunately things just did not work out. But when they paid for Rendon, he was a majorly sought-after free agent at the time. In the 2019 regular season for the Nats, he played 146 games, hit .319 for a batting average, a .598 slugging percentage, a .1010 OPS, a 1.010 OPS, 34 home runs, 126 RBIs, 44 doubles, 117 runs scored, 5 stolen bases, and a 157 OPS plus. That year in 2019, he was also a first-time All-Star and was third in the NL MVP vote. So it made sense. He was paid big-time money by the Angels at the time. He was a very good player. Like I said, was a highly sought-after free agent at that time. He was 29 years old, coming off a World Series title, and was third in the NL MVP vote that season. So there were a lot of teams that were willing to pay him big-time money. The Angels were not the only team. He was supposed to be heading into the prime of his career, and the Angels, as I said, were desperate to put talent next to Shohei and Mike Trout. In the 2019 postseason, he played in 17 games for the Nationals, had 3 home runs, 15 runs batted in, 10 strikeouts to 11 walks, so he walked more times than he struck out in the postseason, adding in a 328 batting average, a 413 on-base percentage, a 590 slugging percentage, and a 1003 OPS. So it made sense that the Angels said, hey, let's go out and pay this guy, because he was having a big-time year in the 2019 regular season, was a force for the Nationals in the postseason, helping them win their first franchise ring in history, and then also was 29 years old and supposed to be heading into the prime of his career. So the Angels were not the only team that was willing to offer a big-time payday to Anthony Rendon. They ended up being the team that he chose, but you can't fault the Angels when you look at where he was at the point of his career at 29 years old, was supposed to be heading into his prime, if not right around his prime at that point, and was coming off a monster season for the Nationals. There were a lot of teams, like I said, that were willing to pay him that money. But now that he's 36 years old, people are going to look at this contract and say it was an ultimate failure, which it was at the end of the day. This contract was a major failure, but I do want to say, in hindsight, it was, I think, the worst contract in MLB history. With that being said, when this deal was signed at the time, there were a lot of teams that were willing to go out and pay Anthony Rendon, and it would have been a mistake for any of those teams when you look back in hindsight. Your vision's always going to be 2020 when you look back, and you obviously know how things went, and you know the outcome. But at the time that this contract happened in December of 2019, there were a lot of teams that were willing to make that deal, and nobody knew that this was how those 7 years were going to work out. Over his entire time in Anaheim, he battled a lot of injuries and also showed some lack of commitment to the game of baseball. And it's not just the injuries. The injuries happen, and sometimes you just have bad luck. But he had some comments in February of 2024 where he basically said baseball was not his top priority. He said, it's never been a top priority for me. This is a job. I do this to make a living. My faith, my family come first before this job. So if things come before it, I'm leaving. And also, over the years, he did complain about the 162 games there are in an MLB season, criticizing that, saying there's too many games. In January of 2024, he said the MLB season was too long and it needed to be shortened. Back in 2014, he also said that he doesn't watch baseball on his own time because it's too long and boring. So when you look at all of these quotes from him, and then you also look at the injuries he had over the years, there's definitely a question about his commitment level and his passion for the game of baseball. And maybe some of these injuries were because he wasn't really staying in shape in the offseason, wasn't committing to being on the best training program, to be at his best health when the MLB season rolled around and spring training came around. No one will know that at the end of the day, but when you look at this contract overall with all of the injuries, and then you see some of his quotes about him basically not caring about the game of baseball and saying that baseball's never been a top priority for him, that is tough to see. And I understand family and religion being a top priority. That makes a lot of sense too. But by saying that baseball is not a top priority for you and it's never been, is basically saying you don't care about the game of baseball and you never did. Fans, ownership, teammates, they don't really necessarily want to hear that when you're getting paid, especially $35 million a year to be one of the best players in the game of baseball, and obviously you're not living up to that potential when you're on the IL and missing a lot of games. His attitude toward the game of baseball just doesn't seem to be positive, doesn't seem like he even wants to be there when you see some of these quotes. And I don't want to speak for Rendon. I'm just going to mention some of those quotes that he mentioned in interviews and said over the years. And when you look at some of those quotes, it just seems like he just was not as committed to the game of baseball as he probably should have been, especially when he got this big-time payday from the Angels to be one of their best players next to Shohei and Mike Trout. The 2020 season was a shortened season, as I mentioned, 60 games. Rendon did play well in that year for the Angels, was 10th in the AL MVP vote that season, with 9 home runs, 31 runs batted in, a 286 batting average, and a 915 OPS, which was a great start for his time in Anaheim. But if you take out the 2020 season and you say, let's just include the 2021 season through the 2026 season, which he's probably going to retire for and not play in, if you include just the last 6 years of the deal, 2021 season through the 2026 season, and you exclude 2020, Rendon hit just 13 home runs over the final 6 years of the contract. Like I already mentioned, with the likely voided out 2026 season due to retirement being included in those 6 years. So in the final 6 years of the contract, hit just 13 home runs, adding in 205 games played, 13 home runs, like I just mentioned, 94 runs batted in, a 231 batting average, a 336 slugging percentage, a 666 OPS, and an 86 OPS plus. So that's very much below average for OPS. Only 13 home runs over 6 years with 94 runs batted in. Just a very disappointing tenure there in Anaheim, especially when you look at it. Started out on a positive note in 2020, had a 915 OPS, and played in 52 games that season out of 60. So it was very impressive. He was playing in a lot of games in the first year of that deal. And then after that, a lot of things just went downhill for Rendon with bad injuries. And then even when he was on the field, he was struggling to put up the production he had in Washington. And you look at that last year in Washington, in 146 games played, he had 34 home runs with 126 RBIs, 44 doubles, and 117 runs scored. You look at his 7 years in Anaheim, he only hit 22 home runs with 125 runs batted in, 112 runs scored, and 50 doubles. In his last season in Washington, he had 34 home runs, 126 RBIs, and 117 runs scored, all three of those being more than his entire tenure in Anaheim in that 7-year deal. And the doubles total was very close. 50 doubles in Anaheim in 7 seasons versus 44 in 2019 with the Nationals. But it really is crazy that he had more home runs, more runs scored, and more runs batted in his last year in Washington in 2019 in the regular season versus his entire 7 years in Anaheim. And you might look at that and say he basically got his big payday and then checked out of the game of baseball, and that might be the truth of it. When you're looking at those numbers and you're looking at the money he got paid $35 million a year, and all that money's guaranteed. It doesn't matter if you're hitting 40 home runs or 10 home runs. Right when that pen hits the paper, it's an official deal and all that money's guaranteed. And the Angels are on the hook for it. And so we'll see what happens here with the last year of his deal potentially being bought out with him choosing to retire. But at the end of the day, it is crazy when you look at how his career went in Anaheim when he was one of the best players in the game of baseball in 2019, was third in the NL MVP vote. And then in his 7 years in LA, with 2026 being the 7th year, and I'm including it here in the conversation just because it was a 7-year, $245 million deal, and we'll see what the buyout ends up being for that 7th season. But no matter what, he's going to get some money, from that 7th season, even if he doesn't even play, and he's probably not going to. He's going to retire, and they're going to find a buyout figure that they can both agree upon. But it is crazy when you look at how things went in Anaheim for him in the 7 years. Just 22 home runs and 125 runs batted in with 112 runs scored. He had more runs, home runs, and RBIs in his last year in Washington in 2019. It was very unexpected, especially when you look at the player he was in 2019 and then how his career just went downhill production-wise once he signed that big-time contract. He was never the exact same player and never really even lived up to anything close to the production he had in Washington. And it's also important to note, it wasn't just the 2019 season where he was a good player. In 2018, he led the NL in doubles, also adding in 24 home runs, 92 runs batted in, a 308 batting average, and a 909 OPS. In 2017, he had 25 home runs, 100 runs batted in, a 301 batting average, and a 937 OPS. In 2016 was kind of a down year for him, just 20 home runs, 85 runs batted in, with a 270 batting average and a 797 OPS. He never did that in any of his years in Anaheim. Never had 20 home runs, 85 runs batted in, with a 270 batting average and a 797 OPS. Wasn't able to do that in any of his full seasons in Anaheim. The 2020 season, he did play well, 2.2 wins above replacement, 9 home runs and 31 runs batted in with a 286 batting average and a 915 OPS. But after that, the next 5 full seasons, from 2021 through 2025, in each of those 5 seasons, he never had 1 year that was close to any of the production he had in his last 4 years in Washington. In his last 4 years in Washington, he had 22.9 wins above replacement for an average of 5.7 per season, adding in 103 home runs, 403 RBIs, a 299 batting average with a 912 OPS and a 135 OPS plus. So it wasn't like 2019 was his 1 year where he was a great player, it was a 1-year wonder, and then after that he never had the same production. He was a very good player for his last 4 years in Washington. And he played in, over that 4-year span between 2016 and 2019, he played in 585 games out of a total of 648 possible regular season games. He played 90% of possible games between 2016 and 2019 for the Nationals. And each of those seasons was a very good player. His wins above replacement total over those 4 seasons was 22.9. He had a 4.3 WAR in 2016, a 6.1 WAR in 2017, a 5.2 WAR in 2018, and a career best 7.3 WAR in 2019, which was his only all-star selection of his career. But he was definitely a very good player and definitely an all-star candidate each and every year in those 4 seasons prior to getting that big-time contract in free agency with the Angels in December of 2019. But it's important to reiterate, he wasn't a one-year wonder. He was a very good player prior to that 2019 season as well. That was obviously a career year where he had career bests in a lot of categories and was a big-time reason that the Nationals won the World Series that year alongside Juan Soto and Max Scherzer. And being a free agent at 29 years old, where you're entering the prime of your career and he was putting up big-time numbers in those 4 seasons prior, it made sense that he got paid the money he got paid. He had a career best 34 home runs in 2019, a career best 126 RBIs in 2019, a career best 44 doubles in 2019, which was among the best in the MLB. Also was number 1 in the MLB with 126 RBIs that year, also adding in a .319 batting average. And in 3 straight seasons between 2017 and 2019, he had a batting average over 300 and an OPS over 900. So it made sense that he got paid the money he got paid. A lot of teams would have paid him that money. Nobody could have ever seen him having the injuries that he had over the past 7 seasons. And nobody could have ever seen his production fall off that much during his time in LA. And you look at his WAR total for the Angels, he had a 3.9 WAR during his career in Anaheim. You look at his WAR in any of his seasons in Washington where he played over 100 games, the lowest WAR he had during his time in Washington where he played over 100 games in a single regular season, his lowest WAR was 4.3 in 2016. You take all of his 7 seasons, with the 2026 season basically being a void year, but I'm including it in here because it was a 7-year deal. You take any of his 7 years over his time in Anaheim, his best WAR was in 2020 with 2.2 wins above replacement in a shortened 60-game season where he played 52 games, and that ended up being the highest percentage of regular season games he played in any individual season in Anaheim. So in the event that Rendon does retire and does not play a game in year 7 of the contract, he would have been paid, and this is including the 7 years, $245 million. It might end up being a little bit less than that last year, considering there's going to be a buyout between the Angels and Rendon. But for the purpose of the math here, 7 years, $245 million. If you divide his total money, $245 million, by his home run total of 22 home runs during his time in Anaheim, he would have made $11.13 million per home run. $11.13 million per home run with the Angels. You take his total money and divide it by his RBIs, he would have $1.96 million per run batted in with the Angels. Then for hits, $914,000 per hit. Per game played, $946,000 per game played with the Angels. And then you look at his total money, $245 million, divided by his total wins above replacement in Anaheim, he would have made $62.82 million per win above replacement, which is just crazy money that he got in respect to the production that the Angels got back. And that total WAR that I have here written, which, as I said already, he had a total of 3.9 WAR during his time in Anaheim. That 3.9 total comes from Baseball Reference. I know Fangraphs WAR has a little bit different of a number than Baseball Reference will probably have, so that's why I want to note that. So now this brings into question the worst MLB contract of all time. And for the most part, I'm excluding current contracts besides 2 examples, Rendon being one of them, even though it's technically probably going to be a contract that's finalized at some point soon with the buyout happening between the Angels and Rendon in the coming weeks. I did include one other current contract in the top 10 worst contracts in MLB history. And number 1, in my opinion, is Anthony Rendon. As I already mentioned, signed a 7-year, $245 million deal in free agency with the Angels on December 11th of 2019. And the Angels never got any sort of production back that warranted $35 million a year or $245 million total in this contract. So that's my number 1 worst contract in MLB history. And if Rendon was healthy, maybe things would have been different. But this is just based on, in every situation that I'm going to mention, this is just based on the total production that the players had over the lifespan of their contract and based on how much money they got for their production over that contract. So obviously if Rendon was healthy and if he put up the numbers he put up in Washington, things would have been different. And I really wish he had the same production he had in Washington. But obviously some bad injury luck played a role. And at the end of the day, with all of these 10 contracts I'm going to mention, a lot of the time players got injured, players retired early, players just kind of fell off and weren't the same player that they were before they got the contract, or, by year 3 of the contract, they kind of started to decline offensively. So there's obviously a lot of different reasons that a lot of these guys are on this list. And at the end of the day, if these guys were playing up the production they had before the contract was signed, things definitely would have been different. But for each and every player, there's a different circumstance. And I do wish every single one of these players had different production levels than they had over the term of their contract. But for each and every player, there's a different reason for why they ended up, tailing off and why their contract ended up being a bad contract. And at the end of the day, this is all in hindsight. Every one of these contracts at the time were signed. And for the most part, a lot of these deals were considered good paydays for these players. And it made sense at the time when they were getting paid. Another thing to note with the game of baseball, a lot of the time when a player hits free agency around 30 years old, to get that player to go to you on a long-term deal, you sometimes have to sign a player rather than on a 7-year deal. You might just sign them on a 10-year deal or 11-year deal and give them more money than you'd like to. And at the end of the day, you're probably chewing years 7, 8, and 9 of the long-term contract. Just because you want that player at the beginning of that contract, when they're in their prime, you want to maximize the amount of production you can have in your lineup. And even though that player is probably not going to be the same player at 35, 36, 37, and 38 years old, you're paying them that big-time 10-year contract because you want them in their prime for years 1 through 4, for example. So every one of these players, there was a different circumstance and a different reason for why they were paid, and each one of these players had a different reason for why things, did not ultimately end up playing to their favor production-wise during the tenure of their contract. So like I mentioned, Rendon is my worst contract in MLB history, but if things were different, if he was healthy, maybe we'd look at this whole situation differently, and maybe he would have been a much different player overall in Anaheim. You look at that 2019 season, though, like I mentioned, a career best in WAR with 7.3, a career best in doubles with 44 in 2019, a career best in RBIs, which led the MLB with 126, also career best in batting average with a 319 batting average, a career best in slugging percentage with a 598 slugging, and a career best in OPS with a 1010 OPS. So he did have a career year in 2019 and was entering the prime of his career at 29 years old. It was one of the best plays in the game of baseball in that 2019 season, and that's why the Angels gave him that big-time payday. But when you look back at it, you look back at all the injuries and the games he missed and the lack of production, it ends up being one of the worst contracts in baseball history. Once Rendon cashed in, he was never the same player and was never anywhere close to what he was when he was in Washington, putting up big-time numbers for that Nationals lineup. And if you look at the injuries he had when he was with the Angels, in 2021, he was on the IL for a groin injury alongside a knee injury. Also had a hamstring injury in 2021. Then in 2022, was on the IL multiple times with wrist injuries. Also had a groin injury in 2023, alongside another wrist injury in 2023 and a shin injury in 2023. The shin injury cost him the rest of the season after July 14th back in 2023. Then in 2024, had a hamstring, back, and an oblique injury. And then 2025, missed the entire season with the hip injury. All in all, if my numbers are correct here, which I counted based on the Spot Track website, they have like an injury list. You can kind of see how many times a player is on the IL and missed games over their career. He had 12 IL stints with the Angels with all sorts of injuries over that time. Hip injuries, groin injuries, wrist injuries. There's definitely a potential chance there that Rendon just wasn't really keeping himself in shape for the game of baseball. Wasn't really necessarily ever ready to play, especially a 162-game season. He was always missing at least half the season. Besides 2020, that was the only season he played a good amount of the regular season games in a single year for the Angels. But his comments about not really caring about the game of baseball as a priority, and a lot of teammates and players, I'm sure, probably around the league don't really love hearing that. And that's why he ultimately got a lot of criticism about whether or not he was committed to the game of baseball. But he's the worst contract in baseball history, in my opinion. That's 7 years, $245 million that the Angels gave him in the 2019 offseason. And now we'll move on to my number 2 worst contract in MLB history, which I'm sure there are some that I'm missing here. So these are just based on the ones that I could remember and also the ones I researched. I mean, all of these contracts I knew about and I was alive for, and that's probably why a lot of them are going to be skewed towards contracts over the last 10 or 15 years or so, since I remember a lot of these, and also, at the end of the day, I'm not going to really know much about some contracts happened in the 80s and the 90s. These are all contracts of the present day that I can just remember, and I obviously know how things turned out with a lot of these contracts. So we'll start out, as I said, Rendon is number one. At number two, I have right-handed pitcher Stephen Strasburg, former pitcher for the Washington Nationals. He signed a 7-year, $245 million contract with the Nationals in the 2019 offseason, right after the Nationals won the World Series. Rendon and Strasburg both got 7-year, $245 million contracts. Rendon signed that on December 11th of 2019 with the Angels. Strasburg signed it with the Nationals on December 9th of 2019. In 2019, Strasburg did have a career year on the mound. A career-high 18 wins on the season, which was one of the best in the game of baseball that year. Also had a 3.32 ERA, logged 209 innings on the mound, which was also one of the best in the game of baseball. Also adding in 251 strikeouts, which was the most in his career in a single season. And he had a 3.25 FIP that year with a 1.03 WHIP. So he's a very good player in that 2019 season, adding in, as I said, a 3.32 ERA. A 1.03 whip, and also 10.9 strikeouts per 9 innings pitched. He was a big-time contributor to the Nationals winning the World Series back in 2019. He pitched 6 times in that 2019 postseason, had a 1.98 ERA with a 2.39 FIP, and a 5-0 record in 6 appearances in the 2019 postseason. He was sensational during that run, and that was definitely part of the reason he got paid that big-time payday. And I know at the end of the day, the injuries are definitely a factor here with a lot of these players, and that is the same story here for Strasburg. He was paid as a result of that great 2019 run. He was really good before that. It's same thing like Rendon. They weren't paid just based off 1 year. You look at Strasburg's numbers, he had a very good year. 5 straight years in a row for the most part, heading into that 2019 season. If you include his entire career, between 2010 and the 2019 season, he had a 3.17 ERA over 239 starts with 1,695 strikeouts over 1,438 and 2/3 innings pitched, with a 1.30 ERA plus and a 2.96 FIP alongside a 1.09 WHIP in those 239 appearances. Was a very good pitcher from age 21 through age 30, which he was 30 in that 2019 season. It made sense he was paid off of that run. He was one of the best players in the game of baseball that year, just like Rendon. They were both very good players and big contributors to them winning the franchise's first title. But injuries tarnished the rest of Strasburg's career with significant shoulder and elbow injuries that caused him to miss a lot of baseball. He retired from the game of baseball on April 4th of 2024. There was a disagreement between the Nationals and also Strasburg in the 2024 offseason. In that same offseason, in spring training, the Nationals left a locker for him in spring training, but he did express his desire to retire at some point. They argued over some of the guaranteed money, but he ended up being given the money he was supposed to get since the Nationals had no long-term injury insurance on his contract. There was $105 million left on his contract when he retired, which the Nationals chose to defer some of the money so that way they weren't really getting hit with $35 million a year. They could spread out some of that money over time. After signing that deal in 2019, Strasburg had a negative .5 WAR for Washington between the 2020 and 2022 seasons. He never threw another pitch in the MLB after June 9th of 2022. So over the duration of the 7-year contract, which originally was supposed to be 2020 through 2026, he only pitched 31 1/3 innings over those 7 years, making 8 starts between 2020 and 2022, had a 6.89 ERA with 28 strikeouts to 17 walks, a 5.69 FIP, and a 1.56 WHIP over that stretch with, as I said, a negative .5 wins above replacement total over that 7-year window. The breakdown of the money is pretty crazy when you look at it. He got paid $7.87 million per inning pitched during that contract, making $2.62 million per out. He also made $8.75 million per strikeout and got paid $30.62 million per start. And like I already mentioned with the Rendon example, I basically took the total amount of money in the contract and then basically divided it by innings pitched. Also divided the total money by strikeouts, divided the total money by starts made over that contract, just to show at the end of the day, a lot of these teams didn't really get the return on their investment that they were hoping for in some of these deals. So Strasburg will be number 2. At number 3, we have Pablo Sandoval. He signed a 5-year, $95 million deal in free agency with the Red Sox back on November 24th of 2014. He was a key contributor to the San Francisco Giants winning 3 World Series rings, including their 2014 run, which was right before he signed that deal with the Red Sox. In the 2014 regular season, Sandoval had 16 home runs, a 739 OPS, and a 279 batting average. Then in the playoffs, he played in 17 postseason games with a 366 batting average, a 465 slugging percentage, an 888 OPS, with 5 runs batted in and 0 home runs over those 17 postseason games back in 2014. You look at those numbers, he wasn't really necessarily ever worth that big-time payday at $19 million a year. The Red Sox at that time were coming off a tough season in 2014, were desperate to keep their win-now window open, and they were never really afraid to spend back then. About a decade ago, they were still spending a lot of money in free agency, so they made the decision to go out and get Sandoval and Hanley Ramirez in the same offseason. Sandoval was a complete miss in Boston. He played 161 games with Boston over 3 seasons between the 2015 and 2017 seasons. He had 14 total home runs for the Red Sox, 59 runs batted in, a 237 batting average, a 360 slugging percentage, a 646 OPS, a 71 OPS plus, which shows he was very much below average during his time in Boston, also adding in a minus 1.6 WAR during his time as a Red Sox, and he had 136 total hits during his tenure in Boston. He arrived at spring training back in 2016 and was heavily criticized for not being in game shape. In that season, he only made 6 at-bats before missing the rest of the year due to injury. He was released by the Red Sox on July 19th of 2017, with the Red Sox paying him $48 million remaining on his contract at the time of his release. If you look at his numbers, he made $6.78 million per home run in Boston, $1.61 million per RBI, $698,000 per hit, and $590,000 per game played. Sandoval's contract was definitely a major miss for the Red Sox. At number 4, we have former first baseman for the Orioles, Chris Davis, who signed a 7-year, $161 million deal with Baltimore on January 16th of 2016. From 2012 to 2015, in his first 4 full seasons in Baltimore, Davis hit 159 home runs, had 412 RBIs, with a 256 batting average, a 533 slugging percentage, and an 876 OPS. He also had a 14.7 wins above replacement total during those 4 seasons from 2012 through 2015. And if you look at the 162-game average for him over that 4-year window, he averaged 4.1 wins above replacement per year and also 44 home runs per year. So was definitely a great player back when he was paid and got this big contract. Back in 2013 and in 2015, he led the MLB in home runs with 53 and 47 respectively. After the big-time payday, though, at 30 years old back in January of 2016, he gradually declined year by year from 2016 through 2020, with his OPS dropping from 923 in 2015 to 792 in year 1 of the new deal back in 2016, to 732 in 2017, to 539 in 2018. He also led the MLB in strikeouts with 219 back in 2016. Also led the league in punchouts back in 2015 with 208. But that year he did lead the league in home runs back in 2015 with 47 homers. So it made sense at the end of the day that there was definitely a lot of strikeout risk every time he got up to the plate. But there's also that raw power that you really can't teach. Back in 2016, his home run total fell to 38. And then to 26 back in 2017, to 16 in 2018, to 12 in 2019, and 0 back in 2016. In 2016, he only played in 16 games. His RBI total did gradually decline as well, from 117 in 2015 before he signed the contract, to 84 in year 1 of the deal back in 2016, to 61 in year 2 in 2017, to 49 in 2018, to 36 in 2019, and then to 1 RBI in 2020. Also, his batting average did fall as well from 262 in 2015 before the deal, to 221 in year 1, to 215 in year 2, to 168 in year 3, to 179 in year 4, and then 115 in year 5. So his batting average fell from 262 before the deal. Then his last year in the major leagues in 2020, it fell to 115. He retired from baseball in August of 2021, with the Orioles giving him the remaining $37.5 million on his deal through deferrals. From 2023 to 2025, he received $9.16 million per year. From 2026 through 2032, his payments will drop to $3.5 million per year. And then from 2033 to 2037, he will be getting paid $1.4 million per year. Now, if you look at the numbers overall and you divide up the total money he got in this contract, divided up by his production, He did get paid heavily, as I said, 7 years, $161 million. He hit just 92 home runs under the new contract with 231 runs batted in and just 363 hits in 2,118 at-bats, which was a 196 batting average, a 379 slugging percentage, and a 670 OPS. Also adding in a negative 2.8 wins above replacement total, which definitely isn't great. Minus 2.8 WAR is not good at all. He had $1.75 million per home run, $443,000 per hit, $696,000 per RBI, and $301,000 per game played. Between the 2018 season and the start of the 2019 season, Davis had a 54 consecutive at-bat streak without a hit, which is the longest in MLB history. With all of that being said, Davis's contract was definitely a mistake in hindsight, but when it was signed back in 2015, he was one of the most feared hitters in the game of baseball. It was just 29 years old at the time, coming off 4 great seasons in a row for the Orioles, averaging 44 home runs per year over the first 4 full seasons he played in Baltimore. So it made sense, the money he got paid. A lot of these guys I'm going to mention were paid around 29 to 30 years old when they were a first-time free agent, and a lot of them cashed in and got big-time paydays based off of their recent production heading into that new contract. Now at number 5, I have Rusney Castillo, former outfielder for the Boston Red Sox. He signed a 7-year, $72.5 million deal with the Red Sox on August 22nd of 2014. He signed that deal with the Red Sox as an international free agent from Cuba. At the time of his signing, it was seen as an overpay by some people, but Castillo did show a lot of raw power before he signed with the Red Sox and had blazing speed, so there's a lot of high upside there as a potential 2020 30-30 player one day in the major leagues. He was just 26 years old when he signed that deal and was viewed as MLB ready right away. He ended up playing just 99 games over his major league career for the Red Sox, between 10 games in 2014, 80 games in 2015, and 9 games in 2016. In 99 career games in the MLB, he hit just 7 home runs with 1.6 wins above replacement, 35 runs batted in, 7 stolen bases, a 262 batting average, a 379 slugging percentage, a 679 OPS, an 82 OPS plus, and 83 total hits. The average MLB batting average back in 2015 was 254, which Rusney was better than. He had a 262 batting average during his time in Boston, as I said, over 99 games. He also had an 18.7% strikeout percentage, which was less than the MLB average, which stood around 20% back in 2015. Looking back at his time in the MLB now, I do wish he was given more of a chance, but at the time when he was on the Red Sox had Andrew Benintendi, Jackie Bradley Jr., Mookie Betts all ahead of him in the outfield, so that's why he really never got much of a second chance in Boston. Looking at his stats from AAA Pawtucket, I think he did deserve another shot. In 5 AAA seasons from 2015 through 2019, he played in 467 games for the Pawtucket Red Sox with 42 home runs total, a 217 RBI total, 51 stolen bases in 74 attempts, a 293 batting average, a 425 slugging percentage, and a 761 OPS. I do think Rusney should have gotten more of a chance, especially back in 2019. He hit 17 home runs that year in 120 games played, with 64 runs batted in and a 278 batting average. Considering where the Red Sox were back in 2020, they were in a rebuild mode. I think Rusney should have gotten another chance, especially in that shortened season where the Red Sox were basically just playing for the 2021 season, which ended up working out. The Red Sox got a high draft pick in 2020, got the 4th overall pick, and took Marcelo Meyer, who at one point was one of the top prospects and one of the best prospects in the game of baseball before entering the major leagues over the last year. But they also did go to the ALCS that following year in 2021. So that 2020 rebuilding year did help the Red Sox to some degree. And Rusney did play very well in Pawtucket back in 2019, which I thought he maybe should have gotten a chance in 2020. In October 2020, his contract did expire, and he was granted free agency, where he ended up being unsigned with a major league club. Rusney is still playing currently in a Mexican independent baseball league at 37 years old, where he played 64 games in 2025 with 5 home runs, 30 runs batted in, a 328 batting average, a 433 slugging percentage, and an 835 OPS. As I said, his contract did expire with the Red Sox at the conclusion of the 2020 season, and then no other major league club signed him. If you look at his contract, 7 years, $72.5 million overall. He made $732,000 per game played, just about $10.3 million per home run hit, $2.07 million per run batted in, $873,000 per hit, $10.3 million per stolen base, and $45.3 million per win above replacement. Like I mentioned, I got these WAR stats from Baseball Reference. But all in all, the contract ended up being a mistake for the Red Sox, but I do think Rusney probably should have gotten another chance considering the big-time payday he had. And also at the same time, he had some productive seasons in Pawtucket. Now moving on to number 6 on the list, and that is David Wright, who signed an 8-year, $138 million extension with the Mets on November 30th, 2012. Before signing this extension after the 2020 season ended, Wright was consistently an MVP candidate year in and year out. He finished 6th in the NL MVP vote in 2012, while also being an All-Star. Back in 2012, he hit 21 home runs with 93 runs batted in, a .306 batting average, a .492 slugging percentage, and an .883 OPS in 156 games with a 7.1 wins above replacement total. After signing that contract, he played well in 2013 at the age of 30 years old and was an all-star selection again with 18 home runs, 58 runs batted in, a .307 batting average, a .904 OPS, and 5.1 wins above replacement. However, after that 2013 season did end, he battled constant injuries, including a spinal stenosis diagnosis back in 2015, and then in June of 2016, he had surgery on a herniated disc in his neck, which ended his 2016 season. After that surgery, he just played 2 total games for the Mets for the rest of his career, with both games being in 2018. Wright did announce his retirement from the game of baseball after the end of the 2018 season and was set to be paid $15 million in 2019 and $12 million in 2020. Although there were disagreements about whether or not he would be paid the remaining money since he was retiring on his own, the Mets and Wright worked out a deal to restructure the $15 million salary for the 2019 season. Wright would be paid out some of that money from the Mets insurance company. Not all contracts have an insurance clause in case of an injury, but some do. And one example is this Mets contract with David Wright. By the numbers, he signed that 8-year deal, as I said, making $138 million overall over that 8-year extension. And Wright played just 323 games between 2013 and 2018, and then missed all of the 2019 and 2020 seasons after he did retire, like I already mentioned, back in 2018. Wright played in just 323 games out of a possible 1,194 games between 2013 and 2018, with all the games that he played falling between 2013 and 2018. He hit 38 home runs during that 8-year contract with 152 runs batted in, a .279 batting average, a .792 OPS, a .124 OPS plus, 7.8 wins above replacement, and 351 total hits. In the last 6 years of the contract, so between the 2015 and 2020 seasons, Wright played just 77 games with 12 home runs, 31 RBIs, 42 runs scored, a .258 batting average, a .798 OPS, and .5 WAR. So obviously not really great numbers here in those last 6 years in any of those categories. He was struggling, especially considering the money he was being paid at the time. So those 323 games he played over the 8-year contract ends up being 27% of potential games he played in. So 323 games out of a possible 1,194 games, and he played just a possible 27% of those games for the Mets over this 8-year contract. And then if you look at the production under the 8-year extension, he was paid $427,000 per game played, had $17.69 million per win above replacement, $3.63 million per home run, $907,000 per run batted in, $393,000 per hit. He made $107 million between the 2015 and 2020 seasons, where he only appeared in 77 games for the Mets over that window. He made $1.38 million per game played between 2015 and 2020, and he got paid $8.91 million per home run hit between 2015 and 2020. In the last 6 years of his contract, he played just 77 games, like I already mentioned, out of a possible 870 games over that stretch, which ends up being just 8.8% of potential games he played in the last 6 years of the deal. So obviously did battle a lot of injuries. Like I already mentioned, he had to retire early on due to them, unfortunately. But before he was paid, with this contract, he was definitely a productive player for the Mets. And at the time, it made sense to pay him. But obviously the injury risks came, a lot more after that year by year. And if you look at it, before he was paid, just like Rendon, just like Strasburg, they were very productive players before they were paid on these new contracts, when they got these new contracts around 30 years old. And then once they got paid those new deals, their production fell off more and more year by year, and obviously the injuries definitely started to pile up more and more year by year. In year one of this deal, though, back in 2013, he was still an all-star, had 5.2 wins above replacement, but then in 2014, 2.1 wins above replacement, 2015, just 0.4 wins above replacement, 2016, 0.2 wins above replacement, and then in 2018, 0 wins above replacement. If you look at how productive he was, though, before this contract, in the prior 9 seasons before this contract was agreed upon, from the 2004 to the 2012 regular season, he was a great player for the Mets. 41.3 wins above replacement over those 9 years, averaging 140 games played per season, averaging 4.6 wins above replacement per season, just about 23 home runs, 91 runs batted in, a 301 batting average, and an 887 OPS per season on average with a 135 OPS plus. He was a very productive player before this contract was signed before the 2013 season, and this was an extension for him. He got a big-time extension from the Mets, ended up being an 8-year, $138 million extension. He already was still under contract when this extension happened, but at the time, he was one of the best players in the game of baseball, and the Mets wanted to lock him up for the future. Unfortunately, after that, his career started to decline each year. He had 18 home runs in 2013, just 8 home runs in 2014, 5 home runs in 2015, 7 home runs in 2016, did not play in 2017, and then had no home runs in 2018 with his OPS falling off heavily. In 2012, before the contract was signed, his OPS was 883. 2013, had a very good year in year one of the contract, a 904 OPS. Did miss some games, though. Did miss 50 games that year, but still had a 904 OPS and a 307 batting average. But then in 2014, had a 698 OPS and a 269 batting average. And that year, he played 134 games in 2014. Ended up being his most games played in a single year under this contract before playing just 77 games over the last 6 years of this contract. Now moving on to number 7, and that's Yoenis Cespedes, former outfielder for the New York Mets. He signed a 4-year, $110 million deal with the Mets on November 29th of 2016. After declining a qualifying offer with the Mets, he got a big-time payday at $27.5 million per year, 4 years, $110 million overall. He did end up becoming a free agent after this deal was over with back in 2020. In 2016, prior to this new deal being signed with the Mets, he hit 31 home runs with 86 runs batted in, a 280 batting average, an 884 OPS, a 136 OPS plus, and he finished 8th in the NL MVP vote in that 2016 season and was also an NL All-Star. So the contract the Mets gave him made sense at the time, but he was 30 years old. After Cespedes signed this deal, he heavily struggled with injuries and only played 127 games over the 4 years of this contract. He played just 81 games in 2017, 38 games in 2018, 0 games in 2019, and then just 8 games in 2020. His OPS fell from 892 in year 1 of the deal to 821 in year 2 to 622 in year 4 after missing all of year 3. When he was on the field at the start of the deal, he was still an effective player, but that definitely declined more and more over time. He could not stay healthy. From 2017 to 2020, he played in just 127 out of a possible 546 games in the regular season for the Mets and compiled 127 hits. So 127 hits, 28 home runs, 75 runs batted in, a 274 batting average, a 516 slugging percentage, an 852 OPS, a 152 OPS plus, and 2.6 wins above replacement overall during that 4-year window. His numbers honestly were solid, but the major issue were the games he was missing. Your best ability a lot of the time, they say, is availability, and he was just not available during this contract for the Mets. He played in just 23% of the games during the contract's lifespan, which is definitely really rough considering the money that the Mets gave him. By the numbers, he made $3.92 million per home run, $1.27 million per run batted in, $866,000 per game played, $866,000 per hit, and $42.3 million per win above replacement. And with a lot of these numbers, I did round up, so they're not always exact. Just to make it easier to say, I try to round them all up. So $866,000 per game he's played over this contract for the Mets. So definitely was a miss there for the Mets, especially considering he was just never really healthy enough for them over that 4-year window. Now moving on to number 8 on the list, and that's Jacoby Ellsbury, former center fielder for the New York Yankees. He signed a 7-year, $153 million deal in free agency with the Yankees on December 3rd of 2013. He was a really good player before this contract. I don't think he was necessarily ever worth that money, but he was a good player, and the Yankees obviously were desperate in free agency to steal a guy from the Red Sox and also add some speed to their lineup. Back in 2011, he was second in the AL MVP vote, with a year that was an anomaly when you look at the rest of his career. He had 32 home runs that year in 2011, 105 RBIs, 39 stolen bases, a .321 batting average, a .552 slugging percentage, and a .928 OPS. He did peak that 2011 season, in my opinion. He had a .321 batting average, which he never really got close to that after that year. 2011 was also the only year he hit over 17 home runs in a year. He hit 16 back in 2014, and that's his second highest home run total over his career, besides the 32 he hit back in 2011. 2011 was also the only season that he was an All-Star, and was also the only season where his OPS was above 785, which he had a 902 OPS his rookie year. And then after that, the 928 OPS in 2011 was his peak. And then he never really got close to that after that. He had a 781 OPS, which was his best OPS after that 2011 season, back in 2013 for the Red Sox. But if you look at his time, he left the Red Sox for the Bronx, got a big-time payday after helping the Red Sox win the World Series back in 2013. During that season, he had a .298 batting average, 9 home runs with 53 runs batted in, and a 781 OPS alongside 52 stolen bases and 56 attempts. After leaving the Red Sox, though, for the big-time payday, he never really was healthy enough and never lived up to the pay that he got from the Yankees. After leaving Boston, he became an average center fielder. His speed numbers fell off. His OPS declined each year. He struggled to stay healthy with hip injuries and shoulder injuries in 2018. He played just 520 games for the Yankees out of a possible 1,032 during the lifespan of the 7-year contract. In 4 years for the Yankees, from 2014 to 2017, he hit just 39 home runs with 198 runs batted in, 102 stolen bases in 127 attempts, a .264 batting average, a .716 OPS, and 511 hits in 520 games played. He did have a 9.6 WAR with the Yankees, which is honestly impressive when you look back at it. Especially when you look at his numbers, you really don't see that when you look at some of his stats, but a 9.6 WAR is impressive considering he did struggle for the most part, especially considering he never really lived up to what he was doing in Boston when he was with the Yankees. His 95 OPS plus in New York proves he was very much average during his tenure in the Bronx. He was released by the Yankees on November 20th of 2019 and was owed around $21 million remaining on his contract. Despite disputes between the Yankees and Ellsbury, he ended up getting, I believe, all $21 million remaining on his contract. He didn't play a single game for the Yankees in the last 3 years of the deal, missing all of the 2018, 2019, and 2020 seasons. If you look at his production by the numbers over the 7-year contract, he played in 520 games for the Yankees out of a possible 1,032, so just over 50% of the potential games for the Yankees he played in. And in that 7-year deal, he got $294,000 per game played, $3.92 million per home run, $15.93 million per win above replacement, $772,000 per run batted in, $1.5 million per stolen base, and $299,000 per hit in New York. As I said, just never lived up to the production he had in Boston. He peaked in 2011. That season had a career high in WAR as well, which his WAR was 8.3 in that 2011 season. In his final year in Boston in 2013, his WAR was 5.8. He played in 134 games. In 2012, he did miss a good amount of the season, only played in 74 games. But in 2013, before he got that payday from the Yankees, he played in 134 games for the Red Sox out of 162 in the regular season. So the Yankees obviously took a risk on him. I do think part of the reason they paid him was because obviously they wanted to add speed to their lineup, but also being able to take him away from the Red Sox. That was definitely a chess move by the Yankees, trying to take away that speed from the Red Sox lineup. It ends up hurting the Yankees in the end, with Ellsbury not playing a single game for the Yankees in the last 3 years of that big-time contract. Now moving on to number 9, I have Kris Bryant, who signed a 7-year, $182 million deal as a free agent with the Colorado Rockies back on March 18th of 2022. He was a 4-time All-Star in his first 7 MLB seasons before signing this contract. He was the NL MVP back in 2016 and also an All-Star selection in 2021, the season before he signed this deal with the Rockies. In 2021, that year prior, before that new contract, He played in 144 games for the Chicago Cubs and San Francisco Giants. He hit 25 home runs with 73 runs batted in, a 265 batting average, and an 835 OPS. Then after this contract happened with the Rockies, just like a lot of these other deals, guys were very healthy and were very productive players for 3 or 4 seasons prior to the new contract. Then they hit age 30, and then in year 1 of the contract, a lot of things just fell apart for a lot of these players, and that's the same story here with Kris Bryant. He played in just 42 games in year 1 of this contract in 2022, hitting just 5 home runs, 14 runs batted in, a 306 batting average, an 851 OPS, and a 128 OPS plus. He suffered back injuries, foot injuries, did have plantar fasciitis that year as well, which cost him 120 games. So he missed a lot of that season, unfortunately. Then in year 2, injuries continued to be a problem. He had a heel injury and a finger injury, causing him to miss 82 games in the 2023 season, playing in just 80 games overall for the Rockies. He had a 233 batting average, 10 home runs, 31 runs batted in, a 680 OPS, and a 77 OPS plus. Then in year 3, in 2024, he played only 37 games with a rib and a back injury, hitting just 2 home runs, 15 runs batted in, a 218 batting average, and a 623 OPS. Then in year 4, most recently in 2025, he played just 11 games, unfortunately, hitting just 1 home run with a 154 batting average, a 400 OPS, and a 7 OPS plus. Was really bad this past year in 2025 in those 11 games he played in. He had recurring back injuries, which have plagued him his entire tenure in Colorado. He was diagnosed with lumbar degenerative disc disease, which is a back injury that causes him pain and discomfort in his regular day-to-day life. And that's obviously a major reason he's not being able to play for the Rockies. He does intend to keep playing. He's no desire to retire despite the nagging back injuries. He's still owed $27 million per year from 2026 through the 2028 seasons. In his 4 seasons in Colorado, he's played just 170 games out of a possible 648 games, which is just 26% of potential games for the Rockies. He has a minus 1.6 WAR with 17 home runs, 61 runs batted in, a 244 batting average, a 370 slugging percentage, a 695 OPS, an 84 OPS plus, and a collective 154 hits during his time in Colorado. So far, he has earned $108 million in 4 years from the Rockies, getting paid $6.35 million per home run, $1.77 million per RBI, $635,000 per game played, and $701,000 per hit. And the story is the same for Bryant, as is a lot of the stories here with a lot of the players on this list. In 2021, before getting his contract, he played 144 games for the Rockies and the Giants. Was a very good player, 25 home runs, 73 runs batted in, adding in an 835 OPS. For the most part, before getting this contract with the Rockies, he was a healthy player. He did miss 26 games back in the 2020 season and also missed 60 games back in the 2018 season. But for the most part, over his career from 2015 through 2021, was a healthy player and a very productive player as well overall, averaging 24 home runs per season over that stretch, also averaging 70 runs batted in per season, a 278 batting average, and an 880 OPS plus, with a 4.1 wins above replacement average over those 7 seasons. The Rockies made this big-time contract with him, hoping that he was going to be the guy that they could potentially build around and have for his prime. Right when he signed this contract, he was right around 30 years old. But unfortunately, right when he signed it, a lot of things just went wrong with him injuries-wise, and he just hasn't been healthy enough. Hopefully that changes, and he still have 3 years left on this contract, so hopefully he can bounce back and have a bounce-back year this coming season in 2026. I know the Rockies have always wanted to get free agents, and at the end of the day, a lot of players go to the Yankees, and they go to the Mets, and they go to the Red Sox, and they go to the Dodgers. They go to big markets where they can have a potential chance to try to win a World Series. The Rockies made this deal with him, hoping that they could maybe change that narrative and be a free agent destination for other players. But obviously, just things have not gone right so far in the first 4 years of this deal. Now moving on to my 10th worst contract overall in baseball history. We have Miguel Cabrera, who signed an 8-year, $248 million extension with the Detroit Tigers on March 28th of 2014. It didn't start up right away. It was an extension, but the money that he got in this contract didn't really kick in until the 2016 season through the 2023 season. He was age 33 by that 2016 season and was age 40 by the 2023 season. Detroit wasn't concerned with his age at the time of this extension. At the time when he signed this back in 2014, he was 31 years old heading into the 2014 MLB season, and he was one of the best hitters in the game of baseball. When he signed this extension before the 2014 season began, he was coming off 2 straight AL MVP seasons in 2012 and in 2013. In 2013, he led the American League in batting average with a .348 batting average, led the AL in slugging with a .638 slugging, and in OPS with a .1078 OPS. In 2012, he won the Triple Crown in the AL with 44 home runs, 139 RBIs, and a .330 batting average. That season also having a .999 OPS. He was one of the most feared hitters in the game of baseball when the Tigers tacked on this 8-year extension to the already remaining 2 years on his previous contract. The 2014 and 2015 years were already agreed upon from his previous deal, and then this 8-year extension, as I said, did kick in when 2016 came around. The money they gave him made sense in the current moment when it was signed, but like many baseball contracts, the first 2 to 3 years are well worth it, and the money's well worth it because the player is very productive, and then over time, the player's production tails off, and the team ends up chewing a big-time contract for the last half of the deal. But this is what you have to do to land and keep top-tier talent on your team. All of these contracts are guaranteed money in the game of baseball, which is why typically players take the top dollar amount in free agency. There are current deals that I want to include in this list, like Xander Bogaerts, but I chose to keep it, for the most part, past contracts with a few current ones with Anthony Rendon, which will likely be over with very soon if he does end up choosing to retire. And then I also did include a current contract with Kris Bryant just because it's really been a tough return on the investment of the Colorado Rockies. They just really haven't gotten as much out of him as they'd like. But a lot of these players, as I mentioned, battled injuries, and each one of these players had contracts that didn't end up being a strong and a good contract for their teams. Some were because they got old, some are because of injuries, some are because they just had really good seasons, a few seasons right before it, and then just tailed off once they signed the new contract. Every one of these players had different circumstances, and at one point, they were all really good baseball players, and that's why they were paid these big-time paydays. They all had a lot of promise and potential, and a lot of them, besides in the one example that I gave that was a player that really didn't play that much in the major leagues, was Rusney Castillo, but everybody else in this, all of the other 9 players, were very good Major League Baseball players that were proven talent and were very good before they signed their new contracts, and ended up being some difficult contracts for some of these teams to chew all of the money on. A lot of these players, though, had injuries that didn't show up until these new contracts came about, and they were very productive players for 4 or 5 years before that. In the example of Anthony Rendon and Kris Bryant, they were very good players and really weren't injury-prone players for the most part before they signed these new contracts. And then once they got these new contracts right around the age of 30, just things started to fall apart for them. But each one of these players were very good players at one point, with 9 of them being proven players at the MLB level, and then Rusney Castillo being a guy that the Red Sox signed as an international free agent, and that obviously ended up being a missed contract there. But I do want to dive back into Miguel Cabrera's contract. In year 1 of this new contract in the 2016 season, he was still very productive, 38 home runs, 108 runs batted in, a .316 batting average, a .956 OPS, a .155 OPS plus, and a 4.9 total WAR in that season. After that 2016 season, he started to decline gradually each year. In year 2 of this contract in 2017, he hit just 16 home runs with 60 runs batted in, a .249 batting average, a .728 OPS, and a -0.9 total WAR. In year 3 in 2018, he played just 38 games with a hamstring and bicep injury, hitting just 3 home runs, 22 runs batted in, an .843 OPS, and .3 total WAR. In year 4 in 2019, at age 36, he hit just 12 home runs with 59 runs batted in, a .282 batting average, a .744 OPS, and a 0 total WAR. Overall, from 2016 through 2023, Cabrera hit .272 in this contract with 103 home runs, 436 runs batted in, a .757 OPS, a .106 OPS plus, 843 total hits, and a 2.4 total WAR in 859 games out of a possible 1,194 total games. By the numbers, he made $2.41 million per home run hit on this new contract, $568,000 per RBI, $288,000 per game played, and $103.33 million per win above replacement. In the example of Anthony Rendon and Kris Bryant, they both went to two franchises that really have never been necessarily a destination place for top-tier free agents. The Angels started to be one after they got Shohei Ohtani. They did start to get some free agent talent, including Anthony Rendon. They obviously wanted to pair that talent with a Mike Trout and a Shohei Ohtani just to maximize that window as much as possible. They had Albert Pujols at one point as well. But the Angels know if they want to get a lot of these big free agents to go to their franchise, sometimes they're going to have to overspend, and that's what they had to do to try to get Anthony Rendon in free agency. And when he did sign that contract, he was one of the best hitters in the game of baseball in the previous 4 or 5 seasons. You do look at Kris Bryant's contract, and you may say, I'm not sure why Colorado would give him that much money. Before he signed that deal, he was still a very productive player and a reliable offensive talent, and that's why Colorado decided to give him a big payday, because they obviously wanted to bring in a big free agent. And Colorado, just like Anaheim, sometimes they have a tough time trying to get top-tier free agents, because when you're getting guys in free agency, you might have to overspend because you might be competing with the Mets and the Red Sox and the Yankees, who are always trying to compete for championship rosters, just like the LA Dodgers, just like the San Diego Padres. They'll always spend top-tier money and always try to give themselves a chance to compete for the playoffs, whether or not things work out. And obviously, payrolls do change year in and year out. So some years you'll spend top-tier money like the Red Sox have in the past, and then in recent years they haven't. Those teams are always committed to spending. If you look at the Angels and the Rockies, for example, sometimes that can be tough to get big free agents to go there. So they may just have to spend big time. And that's because with the Angels, they really haven't had any postseason success over the last 15 years, even with two of the best players in the game of baseball and two Hall of Famers and two of the top players to ever put on cleats in Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani. They never had any playoff success. So that might be tough to get players to go to Anaheim for that. And then if you look at Colorado, they've been in a constant rebuild over recent years, probably over the last 5 years or so. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. This was an episode I definitely enjoyed doing a lot of research on and definitely enjoyed recording. So I do hope you enjoyed all of this insight. And I'm sure there's some contracts I missed on. A lot of these contracts are just recent contracts that I could remember and that I was alive for. And I'm sure there were some really bad contracts in the 80s and the 90s that I forgot. And there may be even some recent day contracts that I didn't really include. I didn't really include, as I said, any current contracts besides Kris Bryant and Rendon. I do think Xander Bogaerts' 11 years, $280 million contract he got from the Padres back in December of 2022 will be one of the worst contracts at some point because of his age. And also, I felt like he was already starting to decline as an offensive player before they gave him that big-time payday. But for the most part, I just kept it to past contracts. And I do want to reiterate, I didn't really want to criticize any of these players with this episode. It was more so just basically naming contracts that didn't really have as great of a return on the team's investment for whoever was giving these big-time paydays. And like I already mentioned, all of these players were very good players at one point, especially 9 of them being proven players at the MLB level when they signed these deals. So it made sense for why they were paid. They had a lot of production, or at one point, one of the top players in the game. And Rusney Castillo was a very promising prospect at one point as an international free agent for the Red Sox. And the reason I've repeated it now a few times, and I'm going to repeat it again, is the intention of this episode was not to slander these players or be disrespectful or overly criticize them. It was more so just to talk about some of the contracts in baseball that didn't really necessarily work out over the years. And it kind of just highlights that in the game of baseball, there's always going to be a lot of bad contracts over time. In hindsight, vision's always going to be 20/20. But a lot of the time, these contracts don't really work out over a long-term deal of like 10 years because it's really difficult for a player to stay productive over 10 full years of a contract, stay healthy, and also be one of the top players in the game of baseball still at the age of 40 years old if they're signing this contract at the age of 30. So it's not really about these players necessarily being players that didn't deserve this money, because at one point they still were one of the top players. And like I already noted, in order to get a lot of these players on your team or to keep this talent around, you have to pay them early with an extension, like Miguel Cabrera and the Tigers. He was still one of the best players in the game of baseball back in 2012 and 2013. So in order to keep him happy and keep him around for 2 or 3 more potential prime seasons, they had to give him a long-term 8-year extension. And the same thing goes for a lot of these players like Rendon, like Kris Bryant. In order to get these guys in free agency, you're going to have to give them long-term deals with a lot of money per season to not only prevent them from staying with their old team, but to also have them in their potential prime seasons from age, let's say 30 to about 32 or 33 years old. In the case of a lot of these players that I mentioned here today, their prime was right before they signed that contract. A lot of them had their prime years around 28, 29, 30 years old, and then maybe even still are very productive players and maybe still in their prime at about 31 or 32, but then they really start to tail off once 33, 34, and their age 35 seasons came around. As I mentioned, each one of these players obviously declined for different reasons, some because of old age, some because of injuries. Maybe some players just had really productive seasons right beforehand and then just had bad luck once they got these new contracts. But every circumstance was very different here. It does seem like a lot of these players, though, their prime is either right before they sign this contract and maybe another year or two after this contract is signed. So between ages 29 and 31 maybe is when a lot of these players really peak. And then after that, they do struggle for years after that. So these teams end up basically just chewing all the money for years to come. It's difficult, but like I already mentioned, that's just the way it is in the game of baseball. In order to keep top-tier talent and then also recruit top-tier talent in free agency, you got to be able to spend big money and be able to do that over long-term contracts like a 6 or an 8 or a 10-year deal like we have as some examples here in this episode. Anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. If there is a contract you feel like I should have included, feel free to give a comment on Spotify or on YouTube. I hope you guys did enjoy listening to this. I, for sure, definitely enjoyed doing a lot of research and recording this episode. Anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good one, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.